The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in June of 1882, and it shattered Florence Dalton's world with 11 brutal words. Margaret died in childbirth. Stop. Baby survived. Stop. Come. Immediately stop. Florence stood frozen in the parlor of her family's Boston home, the thin paper trembling between her fingers. Margaret, her beautiful, vibrant older sister who had left for the wilds of Colorado 3 years ago to marry a cowboy she had met during his cattle drive east. Their parents had been scandalized, but Margaret had always been headstrong, following her heart westward to a town called Granite where the mountains scraped the sky and civilization was still finding its footing. Florence. Her mother's voice drifted from the doorway, tight with worry. Florence looked up, tears already streaming down her face. Margaret is gone. The next week passed in a blur of black dresses and hurried preparations. Florence was 20 years old, unmarried and suddenly bound for Colorado to help raise her infant niece. The arrangement had been swift and practical, orchestrated through terse telegrams between her father and Margaret's widower. The cowboy needed help with the baby. Florence was available. The mathematics of necessity left no room for grief. Her trunk was packed with sensible dresses, a few precious photographs, and the last letter Margaret had sent, dated just 2 months prior, full of excitement about the coming baby and descriptions of her husband's ranch in the high country. Florence read that letter so many times on the train westward that she could recite it from memory, searching between the lines for some warning, some premonition that her sister's time was running short. The train carried her across a continent that seemed to expand endlessly, from the ordered cities of the East through the Great Plains where buffalo grass bent beneath infinite wind, and finally into the climbing terrain of the Colorado Rockies. Other passengers came and went at various stops, their faces blurring together, but Florence barely noticed them. She pressed her forehead against the window and watched America transform, feeling like she was traveling not just through space, but through time itself, moving backward into a rawer, more elemental world. Granite, Colorado announced itself with a wooden sign as the train pulled into the small station on a bright afternoon. The town clung to a valley between towering peaks, a collection of weathered buildings that looked temporary, as though a strong wind might scatter them like cards. Florence gathered her carpetbag and stepped onto the platform, her legs unsteady after days of rattling travel. The air was thinner here, sharper, scented with pine and something else she couldn't name. Freedom, perhaps, or danger. She scanned the small crowd gathered at the station, looking for the man from Margaret's descriptions. Her sister had written about Austin Reeves with such warmth, painting pictures of his quiet strength and the gentle way he handled horses. Florence had built an image in her mind during the journey, a weathered rancher, probably in his 40s, worn down by hard living and now by grief. "Miss Dalton." Florence turned toward the voice and felt her breath catch unexpectedly. The man standing before her was young, perhaps 25 at most, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a faded blue shirt, a hat in his hands that he was worrying with his fingers. This was Austin Reeves. This was Margaret's husband. Yes, Florence managed, suddenly aware of how dusty and rumpled she must look. "Mr. Reeves, Austin, please." His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. Up close, Florence could see the grief carved into his face, the shadows under his eyes, the tight set of his jaw. "I appreciate you coming all this way. I know it cannot be easy. Margaret was my sister." Florence kept her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Where else would I be?" Something flickered in Austin's expression, gone too quickly to read. He reached for her trunk as the porter set it down. "The wagon is just here. The ranch is about an hour's ride." As Austin loaded her belongings, Florence studied him more closely. He moved with an economy of motion, each gesture purposeful and controlled. There was a contained quality to him, as though he was holding something immense at bay through sheer force of will. She recognized it because she felt the same pressure building inside herself, grief and uncertainty and fear all tangled together. The wagon was simple but well maintained, pulled by two sturdy horses that nickered softly as Austin helped Florence onto the bench seat. His hand was calloused and warm, and he released her the moment she was settled, as though the contact had burned him. He climbed up beside her and took the reins without a word. They rode through Granite's Main Street, and Florence tried to absorb everything at once. The general store with its false front, the saloon with the cheerful piano music spilling through its doors despite the early hour, a church with a white steeple, looking almost defiant in its prim Eastern architecture. People on the wooden sidewalks turned to watch them pass, curiosity plain on their faces. She could almost hear their thoughts. "There goes Austin Reeves with Margaret's sister, the one who's come to replace her." The thought made Florence's stomach turn. She wasn't here to replace anyone. She was here because a baby needed care, and because she couldn't bear to stay in Boston knowing that Margaret's child was growing up without family nearby. "How is the baby?" Florence asked as they left the town behind, following a rutted road that climbed into pine forest. Austin was quiet for so long that Florence thought he might not answer. Then, "She is healthy, strong lungs. The doctor says she is thriving, considering." He paused. "I named her Hope. Margaret and I had discussed names, and that was her choice if we had a girl." "Hope." Florence tested the name, feeling tears prick her eyes again. "That's beautiful. Your sister was beautiful." Austin's voice was barely above a whisper. "Inside and out. I know everyone must have thought I was some fortune hunter, convincing an educated Eastern woman to marry me and come out here. But I loved her. I loved her the moment I saw her in that Boston tearoom, and I loved her every day after. I would have given anything to save her." The raw pain in his words made Florence's throat tight. "I believe you," she said softly. "Margaret's letters were full of happiness. She loved you too. She loved this life you built together." Austin nodded once sharply and said nothing more. They climbed higher into the mountains, the road narrowing to little more than a track. The forest pressed close on either side, broken by occasional meadows where wildflowers blazed in impossible colors. It was beautiful in a way that made Florence's heart ache. Margaret had seen this view. Margaret had traveled this road countless times. Margaret had made a home here. The ranch appeared around a bend, nestled in a natural clearing with mountains rising dramatically behind it. The house was modest, built of logs chinked with mud, but it had a front porch and glass windows, and someone had planted flowers along the foundation. A barn stood nearby, solid and well-built, with a corral where several horses grazed. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard. It was humble compared to Florence's Boston home, but there was something appealing about its simplicity, its honesty. "It is not fancy," Austin said, a defensive edge creeping into his tone. "It is lovely," Florence replied and meant it. Austin helped her down from the wagon, and this time Florence noticed how carefully he avoided looking directly at her, as though meeting her eyes might undo him. He carried her trunk to the porch, and the front door opened before they reached it. A woman emerged, older and solid, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She held a small bundle wrapped in white cotton, and Florence's heart lurched. "The baby." "This is Mrs. Chen," Austin said. "She has been staying here since Margaret passed, helping with Hope. She is the best midwife in the county." Mrs. Chen's weathered face creased with sympathy as she looked at Florence. "You have your sister's eyes," she said gently. "The same green. Come meet your niece." Florence climbed the porch steps on trembling legs. Mrs. Chen pulled back the cotton blanket, revealing a tiny face, pink and perfect with a dusting of dark hair. The baby was asleep, her miniature hands curled into fists, her expression peaceful. "Oh," Florence breathed, and then she was crying, unable to hold it back any longer. This was Margaret's daughter. This tiny, perfect creature was all that remained of her sister's presence in the world. Mrs. Chen made a sympathetic sound and carefully transferred the baby into Florence's arms. Hope weighed almost nothing, warm and soft, and she stirred slightly at the movement before settling again. Florence looked down at her niece's face and felt something shift inside her chest, something fundamental clicking into place. "Hello, Hope," she whispered. "I am your Aunt Florence. I am here now. I promise I will take care of you." When she looked up, she found Austin watching her with an expression of such naked longing that it took her breath away. Then he blinked and the mask was back, his face carefully neutral. "I will bring your trunk inside," he said abruptly, and disappeared into the house. Mrs. Chen gestured for Florence to enter. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but clean and organized. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove, a sturdy table and chairs. A rocking chair sat near the window, a basket of mending beside it. Florence could imagine Margaret sitting there, working on some repair while watching the mountains turn gold in the sunset. "The bedroom is through there," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to a door on the left. "Austin has been sleeping in the barn since I arrived. There is a smaller room as well, which Margaret was preparing as a nursery. You can sleep there with the baby nearby." Florence nodded, still holding Hope, reluctant to let her go. Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen showed Florence the rhythms of the household. Where things were kept, how the stove worked, when the baby typically fed and slept. Hope was eating well, taking milk from a wet nurse in town whom Mrs. Chen brought her to twice daily. "Though now that you are here, we can arrange for the milk to be delivered," Mrs. Chen said. "That will be easier than transporting the baby." Austin reappeared, having stabled the horses and stored Florence's trunk in the small nursery room. He moved through the house like a ghost, present but not really there, and Florence noticed how Mrs. Chen watched him with worried eyes. "He barely eats," the older woman murmured to Florence when Austin stepped outside again. "Barely sleeps. He works himself to exhaustion every day and then sits up at night. I am glad you are here. He needs family, even if he will not admit it." "I am not his family," Florence said quietly. "I am Hope's family." Mrs. Chen gave her a long, measuring look. "You are here. That makes you family enough." The older woman stayed for dinner, which Florence insisted on preparing despite her exhaustion from travel. It felt good to have something to do with her hands, to chop vegetables and stir soup, even in an unfamiliar kitchen. Austin came in when called, washed at the basin by the door, and sat at the table with the air of a man facing an ordeal. The meal was quiet, painfully awkward. Florence tried several times to start conversation, but her attempts fell flat. Austin answered in monosyllables when he answered at all, pushing food around his plate more than eating it. Only when Hope began to fuss did some animation return to his face. He looked toward the basket where the baby lay with such intensity that Florence felt like an intruder witnessing something private. "I can get her," Florence offered. "I will do it." Austin was out of his chair before Florence could move, lifting his daughter with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. He held Hope against his chest, murmuring something too soft to hear, and the baby settled immediately. Florence watched them, her chest tight. This was what grief looked like when love survived it. Austin Reeves was barely holding himself together, but for his daughter, he was trying. After dinner, Mrs. Chen gathered her things to leave. "I will bring the milk tomorrow morning," she told Florence, "and I am in town if you need anything. Austin knows where to find me." "Thank you for everything you have done," Florence said sincerely. The older woman patted her arm. "Your sister was a good woman. She talked about you often, hoped you might visit once the baby came." Her eyes glistened. "I am sorry it happened this way." After Mrs. Chen left, the house felt even smaller, the silence between Florence and Austin heavy with all the things neither of them could say. Austin settled Hope back in her basket, and then stood awkwardly, clearly wanting to escape but trapped by social convention. "You must be exhausted from your journey," he finally said. "I will leave you to rest. I am in the barn if you need anything." "Austin," Florence said impulsively. He paused at the door, not turning around. "I know this is difficult. I know you probably wish it was Margaret here and not me. But I promise I will do my best with Hope. I promise I will honor my sister's memory." His shoulders tensed, and for a long moment he stood frozen. Then he said very quietly, "Good night, Miss Dalton," and was gone. Florence stood alone in Margaret's kitchen, in Margaret's house, holding Margaret's baby, and let herself cry properly for the first time since the telegram arrived. The next few days established a rhythm, fragile and uncertain but functional. Florence rose early, heated water, prepared bottles with the milk Mrs. Chen delivered. Hope was a good baby, fussy only when hungry or needing changing, and Florence found herself falling completely in love with her niece. Every expression, every small sound felt like a miracle. Austin remained a ghost, present at the edges of her awareness but never truly there. He came in for meals that Florence prepared, ate mechanically, and disappeared again. She could hear him working around the property, the sound of hammering or chopping wood, the low murmur of his voice talking to the horses. Once she looked out the window at dawn and saw him sitting on the corral fence, silhouetted against the pink sky, his head bowed as though in prayer. On the third day, Florence decided she had had enough of the awkward silence. She prepared a proper breakfast, eggs and bacon and fresh bread she had baked the night before, and when Austin appeared at the table, she sat down across from him with determination. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. Austin looked up, startled. "What, the ranch? Margaret wrote about it, but I want to hear it from you. How many acres? What do you raise? How did you come to own land here?" For a moment she thought he would retreat into monosyllables again. Then something in his expression shifted, and he began to talk. Slowly at first, then with growing ease. The ranch was 200 acres, he explained, granted to him as payment for work he had done breaking horses for a wealthy landowner. He raised cattle primarily, a small herd that he was building carefully, along with horses that he trained and sold. The work was hard, but the land was good, and he had plans to expand. As he talked, Florence watched his face come alive, the deadness in his eyes receding. This was what Margaret had fallen in love with, she realized. Not just the man's looks, though Austin was undeniably handsome, but this passion, this vision of building something lasting. Margaret wanted to plant an orchard, Austin said suddenly, his voice catching. "Apple trees." She said this valley got enough water and the elevation was right. I told her we would do it next spring. He fell silent, the grief crashing back over him. "We could still do it," Florence said gently. "In her memory, Hope could grow up with her mother's trees." Austin's eyes met hers for the first time in days, really met them, and Florence felt the impact like a physical force. Up close, with sunlight streaming through the window, his eyes were not just gray but flecked with blue and green, like river stones. There was so much pain in them that Florence wanted to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. She would have liked that, he finally said, his voice rough from that morning. Things began to change between them. Not dramatically, but in small increments. Austin started staying for meals instead of bolting the moment he finished eating. Florence asked questions, and he answered them. She told him about Boston, about their parents, about Margaret's childhood. In return, he shared stories of his life, how he had grown up in Texas, worked as a ranch hand from the age of 14, slowly saved enough to strike out on his own. "I met Margaret 3 years ago," Austin said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, Hope asleep in Florence's arms. "I was delivering cattle to a buyer in Boston. My boss took me to this fancy tea room, and I felt like a fool in my best clothes that still were not good enough. Then Margaret walked in with her friends, and it was like the sun came out. She was laughing at something, and the sound just went straight through me." Florence smiled, able to picture it perfectly. Margaret had always lit up a room. She dropped her glove, Austin continued, staring out at the darkening mountains. "I picked it up and handed it to her, and she smiled at me, and I knew right then that my life had just changed. We talked for hours that day. Her friends were scandalized, but Margaret did not care what anyone thought. She made her own decisions." "She always did," Florence agreed softly. Austin glanced at the baby in her arms. She was so happy about Hope. Scared too, but mostly happy. She had everything planned out, all these ideas for how she wanted to raise her. "She made me promise that if anything happened, I would make sure Hope knew she was loved, that she came from love." "And she will," Florence said. "We will make sure of it." The "we" slipped out naturally, but once said, it hung in the air between them, significant. Austin looked at Florence again, and this time something shifted in his expression, a kind of awareness that had not been there before. "You look like her," he said quietly, "but you are different too. Margaret was fire, you are something else, something steadier." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "I do not know if that is a compliment." "It is," Austin said, and there was something in his tone that made Florence's heart beat faster. The moment stretched, charged with possibility, and then Hope stirred and began to fuss, breaking the spell. Florence stood quickly, murmuring about needing to put the baby to bed, and escaped into the house with her pulse racing. That night, lying in the small nursery room with Hope's basket beside her bed, Florence stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through the tangle of her emotions. She had come here out of duty, to help care for her niece and honor her sister's memory. She had not expected to feel drawn to Austin Reeves. Had not expected to find herself thinking about the way his rare smiles transformed his face, or the gentle competence of his hands, or the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. It felt like a betrayal of Margaret, these feelings. Wrong and inappropriate. Austin was her sister's husband, still deep in mourning. And yet Florence could not deny what was growing inside her, tender and confusing and real. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Florence was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked up to see a rider approaching. The man was older, probably in his 50s, with a silver-streaked beard and an air of authority. He dismounted near the porch where Austin was repairing a section of railing. "Reeves," the man said, his tone cool. "Mr. Dalton," Austin replied, straightening up, and Florence's stomach dropped. "Their father." She hurried over, still holding a wet sheet, as her father turned to look at her. His face was weathered from the journey, his expression stern. "Florence." "Father, I did not know you were coming. Your mother and I needed to see where Margaret lived, to see the child." His eyes swept over the property with barely concealed disapproval. "We arrived in Granite this morning. The woman at the hotel told us how to find this place." Austin had gone very still, his expression closed. Florence could feel the tension radiating from him. "Hope is inside," Florence said. "Come, I will show you." Her father followed her into the house, leaving Austin on the porch. Florence lifted Hope from her basket, and her father's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at his granddaughter. "She has Margaret's chin," he said gruffly. "And your eyes," Florence replied. "The same shape, anyway." Her father reached out a tentative finger, and Hope wrapped her tiny hand around it reflexively. For a moment, Florence saw real emotion crack through his usual reserve. "Your mother is resting at the hotel," he said. "She has not been well since we received the news. This journey has been hard on her. I will bring Hope to town tomorrow so she can meet her," Florence promised. Her father nodded, then looked around the modest house. "You cannot mean to stay here permanently. Hope needs me. The child needs proper care, proper education. She should come back to Boston where she will have every advantage. She should stay where her father is," Florence said firmly. "Austin loves her. You should see them together." "Austin." Her father said the name with distaste. "The cowboy who seduced your sister into this wilderness." "The man Margaret chose," Florence corrected, feeling her temper rise. "The man she loved. Father, you should have read her letters. She was happy here, truly happy. And now she is dead." Her father's voice was harsh. "Dead in childbirth in this God-forsaken place, probably without proper medical care." There was nothing to be done. Austin's voice came from the doorway, low and controlled but with steel underneath. "The doctor was here. Mrs. Chen is the best midwife in Colorado. Margaret had every care I could provide. Sometimes God just takes people, no matter what we do." Her father turned to face him, and Florence saw Austin's hands clench at his sides. The two men stared at each other, the air crackling with hostility. "She never should have come here," her father said. "You had no right." "I had every right," Austin said quietly. "She was my wife, and I would give anything to have her back, anything. But I cannot change what happened. All I can do now is honor her memory and raise our daughter the way she would have wanted. And what does a cowboy know about raising a child?" Her father's contempt was evident. "What kind of education can you provide? What kind of future?" "A future with love and land and open sky," Austin said. "The same things Margaret valued. Margaret was confused, blinded by some romantic notion." "That is enough." Florence's voice cut through the tension, sharp with anger. "Father, Margaret was not confused. She knew exactly what she wanted and she found it. This arguing helps nothing. She is gone, and we must do what is best for Hope now." Her father looked at her, something calculating in his expression. "Which is why you should bring the child home to Boston. You have no reason to stay in this wilderness." Florence understood then what he was really saying. He expected her to take Hope and return east, removing both his granddaughter and his remaining daughter from Austin's influence. It was the practical solution, the sensible one. 6 weeks ago, Florence might have agreed. But now, standing in this house that Margaret had made a home, holding a niece she already loved desperately, knowing that outside Austin was probably bleeding from her father's words, Florence discovered something she had not known about herself. She was stronger than she had realized, more certain. "My reason is Hope," she said clearly, "and Hope belongs with her father." Her father's face darkened. "You would throw your life away like your sister did." "I would honor my sister's choices and help care for her child," Florence replied. "If that means staying here, then I stay." They stared at each other, and Florence saw the moment her father recognized her resolve. His expression shifted, disappointment mixing with something that might have been grudging respect. "Your mother will want to see the child," he finally said. "Tomorrow, of course, I will bring her to town." After her father left, Florence stood holding Hope, her heart pounding. She heard Austin's footsteps on the porch, then the sound of hammering resuming, harder than necessary. She settled the baby in her basket and went outside. Austin was attacking the railing repair with unnecessary force, his jaw tight. Florence approached cautiously. "I am sorry about my father," she said. "He is right." Austin did not look up. Margaret should have stayed in Boston, should have married some rich merchant and lived in comfort. She would still be alive. You do not know that. Women die in childbirth everywhere, even in Boston. But I would not be responsible. Florence moved closer, driven by an impulse she did not fully understand. "Austin, look at me." He finally did, and the anguish in his eyes made her breath catch. "Margaret chose you," Florence said fiercely. "She chose this life. She was happier here than she ever was in Boston. I know because I saw the difference. She bloomed here. She was free. Yes, she died too young, too soon, and it is unfair and terrible, but you cannot take responsibility for a choice she made gladly." "How can you know that?" His voice was raw. "Because I can feel it," Florence said simply. "In this house, in this land, her joy is still here. Her love is still here." She hesitated, then added softly, "And because I am beginning to understand why she chose this. Why you were worth leaving everything for." The words hung between them, too honest, too revealing. Austin stared at her, and Florence saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something else, something that made her blood warm. "Florence," he said, and her name in his voice was different than it had been before. "I should check on Hope," Florence said quickly, suddenly afraid of what might happen next, and fled back into the house. She spent the rest of the day avoiding being alone with Austin, shaken by her own boldness. What was she thinking, saying such things? He was grieving, vulnerable, and she was his dead wife's sister. It was wrong on every level. But that night, lying in the darkness, Florence could not stop thinking about the way Austin had looked at her, the tone of his voice when he said her name. Could not stop remembering the way her heart had raced, the way every nerve in her body had come alive. She was falling for him. Despite everything, despite all the reasons it was impossible, she was falling for Austin Reeves. The next day, Florence bundled Hope up and drove the wagon into Granite, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between herself and Austin. The town was busier than it had been when she arrived, a Saturday bringing ranchers and their families in for supplies and socializing. Her mother was waiting at the hotel, and the reunion was tearful. She held Hope and wept, and Florence wept with her, and for a little while the grief was fresh and overwhelming again. But eventually her mother's tears subsided, and she studied her granddaughter with a mix of sorrow and wonder. "She is beautiful," her mother whispered. "So beautiful." "Yes," Florence agreed. "Your father says you mean to stay here." Florence had expected this. "Hope needs me." "And what do you need, Florence?" Her mother's eyes were searching. "What about your own life, your own future?" "I have a future here, helping raise my niece. Helping raise another woman's child in another woman's house." Her mother's tone was gentle but pointed. "Is that truly what you want?" Florence had no answer for that. She did not know what she wanted anymore. Everything was confused, tangled up with grief and duty, and these growing feelings that she should not be having. Her parents stayed in Granite for 3 days before continuing their journey back east. Her father remained cold toward Austin, but her mother showed more grace, thanking him awkwardly for taking care of Margaret. On the morning they left, her mother held Florence tight. "Write to me," she said. "Tell me honestly how you are. If you need to come home, there is no shame in it." "I know, Mama." But as Florence watched the stage carry her parents away, she knew she would not be returning to Boston anytime soon. Whatever happened, her place was here now. The summer deepened, and with her parents' departure, something seemed to settle in the household. Without the external pressure, Florence and Austin found their own equilibrium. They worked together more easily, their conversations growing longer and less guarded. Austin began teaching Florence about the ranch, showing her how to handle the horses, explaining his plans for the land. Florence discovered she had an affinity for the work, enjoying the physical labor and the direct connection to the earth. One afternoon in late July, Austin took her to a high meadow on the property where wildflowers grew in profusion. Hope was strapped to Florence's chest in a sling Mrs. Chen had made, sleeping peacefully against her heartbeat. "This is where I want to plant the orchard," Austin said, gesturing to the gentle slope. "The drainage is good and it gets sun most of the day." Florence turned in a slow circle, taking in the view. The mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still dusted with snow even in summer. The sky was impossibly blue, and the air smelled of pine and flowers and something wild that she was learning to associate with freedom. "It is perfect," she said. Austin was watching her, not the land. "You have taken to this life," he observed. "I did not expect that." "Neither did I," Florence admitted. "In Boston, I always felt like I was waiting for something, like I was incomplete somehow, but here, everything feels more real, more vivid." "Margaret said the same thing," Austin said softly. Then, after a pause, "But you are not Margaret." Florence looked at him, her heart beginning to pound. "No, I am not. You are your own person, different. I need to stop comparing." "Austin, I am not saying this right." He took off his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Florence, I need to tell you something. Need to be honest before this goes any further." "Any further?" Florence's voice was barely a whisper. "I notice you," Austin said bluntly. "I try not to. I tell myself it is wrong, disrespectful to Margaret's memory. You are her sister. You came here to help with Hope, not to deal with my complications. But I cannot help it. When you are near, I am aware of you. When you are not, I find myself looking for you. And it is killing me because I should still be grieving, should only be thinking of Margaret, but instead I am thinking about you." Florence stood frozen, Hope a warm weight against her chest, the mountain air suddenly not enough to fill her lungs. She had imagined this conversation 100 times and never expected it to actually happen. "I think about you too," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know I should not. I know it is too soon, too complicated, but I cannot help how I feel when I am near you. Like something is pulling me toward you, something I cannot fight." Austin took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Your father would say I am trying to replace Margaret with the nearest substitute." "My father does not understand anything about this," Florence said fiercely. "You are not trying to replace anyone, and I am not here because I have no other options. I am here because I choose to be, because being here feels right in a way nothing else ever has." "Florence." Austin reached out, his hand hovering near her face, not quite touching. "I do not want you to stay out of obligation. I do not want you to sacrifice yourself." "What if it is not a sacrifice?" Florence asked. "What if this is exactly where I am supposed to be?" The space between them felt charged, electric. Austin's hand finally made contact, his fingers gentle against her cheek, and Florence leaned into the touch like a flower turning toward the sun. She saw the moment his resolve broke, saw it in the way his eyes darkened, and then he was leaning down and she was rising up, and their lips met in a kiss that felt both shocking and inevitable. It was nothing like Florence had imagined kisses would be. There was heat, yes, and sweetness, but also something rawer, more desperate. Austin kissed her like she was water and he was dying of thirst, and Florence responded with equal hunger, her free hand fisting in his shirt. Hope was secure between them, a reminder and a promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Austin pressed his forehead against hers. "Tell me this is all right," he said roughly. "Tell me I am not making a terrible mistake." "It is all right," Florence whispered. "I do not have Margaret's blessing to give, but I think she would understand. I think she would want us both to find happiness again." "I loved her," Austin said, his voice breaking. "I need you to know that. I loved your sister with everything I had." "I know, and I loved her too. But she is gone, and we are here, and we are allowed to keep living." Florence pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "We are allowed to love again." Austin's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I am afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of losing someone else, afraid of caring too much." "I am afraid too," Florence said, "but I would rather be afraid with you than safe without you." He kissed her again, softer this time, and Florence felt something inside her settle and bloom at once. This was right. Complicated and messy and probably too soon by society's standards, but right. They stood in the meadow for a long time, holding each other, and when they finally walked back to the ranch, something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer Austin and Florence, the grieving widower and the sister who came to help. They were something new, something fragile and promising. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. They were careful around each other, mindful of the situation's sensitivity, but there was no denying the pull between them. Austin began sleeping in the house again, in the main bedroom, while Florence kept the nursery room. But in the evenings, after Hope was settled, they would sit together on the porch and talk for hours, learning each other's stories, building something real from shared grief and growing affection. In early August, a rider brought news that changed everything. One of Austin's cattle buyers was coming through Granite in 2 weeks and wanted to meet. It was an important contact, potentially very profitable, but it meant Austin would need to go to town for a day, leaving Florence and Hope alone at the ranch. "Will you be all right?" Austin asked, though Florence could see he was already mentally preparing for the meeting. "We will be fine," Florence assured him. "It is only 1 day." But the morning Austin left, Florence felt nervous in a way she had not anticipated. The ranch was isolated, beautiful but remote, and she realized how much she had come to rely on Austin's presence. Still, she was determined to prove she could handle things on her own. The day went smoothly at first. She fed Hope, did the morning chores, spent the afternoon in the garden Margaret had planted. But as the sun began to set and Austin had not yet returned, Florence's anxiety grew. She prepared dinner, fed Hope again, tried to read by lamplight but kept glancing at the door. It was fully dark when she heard hoofbeats. Florence's relief was immediate, but then she registered that there were multiple horses. Austin would be alone. Her heart began to race as she heard voices outside, rough male laughter. She quickly extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through the curtains. 3 men were dismounting near the barn, and even in the darkness she could tell they were not friendly visitors. Florence's mind raced. She was alone with a baby, miles from town, with strangers on the property. She moved quietly to the nursery, lifting Hope from her basket, grateful that the baby was sleeping soundly. There was a rifle above the fireplace, but Florence had only fired a gun once, during a lesson Austin had insisted on giving her. Still, it was better than nothing. She had just reached for the rifle when the porch steps creaked. Someone tried the door handle, found it locked. Then came a knock, hard and demanding. "Anyone home?" a voice called. "We saw smoke from the chimney." Florence said nothing, clutching Hope tighter. "Come on now, we know someone is in there. We are just looking for water for our horses. No need to be unfriendly." Florence's instinct screamed that these were not men seeking water. She moved silently to the bedroom, where there was a root cellar access hidden under a rug. She had just lifted the door when she heard glass breaking. They were coming in through a window. She descended quickly into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut above her just as she heard footsteps entering the house. Hope stirred against her chest, and Florence held her breath, praying the baby would not cry. The men were talking above her, moving through the house. She heard furniture being overturned, drawers being opened. "Looking for valuables," one said. "Ranch this nice must have something." "Where is the woman?" another voice asked. "Saw laundry on the line, woman's things. Maybe she ran, or maybe she is hiding." Florence pressed herself against the cellar wall, heart hammering. Hope began to whimper, and Florence frantically tried to soothe her, rocking and murmuring the softest sound she could manage. Above, the footsteps moved closer to the bedroom. Then she heard something else, hoofbeats approaching fast. A moment later, Austin's voice rang out hard with authority. "Get away from that house. Now." "Easy, friend," one of the intruders said. "We are just passing through." "You are breaking into my home. That is not passing through." Florence heard the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. "I will give you 10 seconds to mount up and ride out. Otherwise, the sheriff will be finding 3 bodies come morning." There was a tense silence, then scuffling sounds as the men retreated. Florence heard horses departing at a gallop, and then Austin was in the house, calling her name with barely controlled panic. "Florence, Florence, where are you?" She pushed the trapdoor open. "Here, I am here." Austin appeared in the doorway, and the relief on his face was profound. He helped her up from the cellar, his hands shaking as they steadied her. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "No, I hid. We are fine." But now that the danger was past, Florence began to tremble. Austin pulled her into his arms, careful of Hope between them, and held on tight. Florence could feel his heart racing, could feel the adrenaline still coursing through him. "I am sorry," he said into her hair. "I am so sorry. I should not have left you alone. You could not have known. How did you get back so quickly?" Something felt wrong. "I could not explain it, but I just knew I needed to get home, so I cut the meeting short and rode hard." He pulled back to look at her. "You hid in the cellar. It was all I could think of." "That was smart, very smart." He cupped her face in his hands. "God, Florence, if something had happened to you." She cut him off with a kiss, fierce and grateful. "When they broke apart," she said, "but it did not. You came home. We are safe." That night neither of them wanted to be alone. Austin laid blankets on the floor of the nursery room and insisted on sleeping there, his rifle within reach. Florence did not argue. She lay in bed with Hope beside her, listening to Austin's breathing in the darkness, and felt safer than she had ever felt in her life. In the morning, Austin rode to town and returned with the sheriff, who organized a posse to track the intruders. They were found 2 days later, wanted men from Wyoming, and were taken into custody. The incident became the talk of Granite, and suddenly Florence was not just the Eastern woman who had come to replace her sister. She was the brave woman who had protected her niece during a home invasion, and Austin was the rancher who had defended his family with courage. Family. The word had become real without Florence quite noticing. She was not just the aunt anymore. She was part of something larger, something that felt permanent. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Austin reached over and took Florence's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about the future, about what comes next." Florence's heart began to pound. And I do not want you to feel pressured. I do not want you to think you have to stay because of Hope or because there are no other options. But I need you to know that I want you here, not just as help with the baby, as my partner. As my wife, if you will have me. Florence stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. A proposal. Austin was proposing to her. "It has only been a few months," she said, though her heart was singing. "I know. And if you want to wait, we can wait. I am not trying to rush you." "But Florence," I love you. It is different from what I felt for Margaret, and I am not trying to replace her. But what I feel for you is real and deep and true. You make me want to build a future again. You make me believe that life can be good after loss." Tears were streaming down Florence's face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or wrong somehow. But I love you, Austin. I love hope. I love this life we are building." "Then marry me," Austin said, his voice rough with emotion. "Marry me and let us make this official. Let us be a real family." "Yes," Florence said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Austin kissed her then, deep and claiming, and Florence knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They were married in September, in the little white church in granite with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Chen stood with Florence, and one of Austin's ranch hands stood with him. Hope was there too, gurgling contentedly in a lace gown that Margaret had sewn, ready for this day even though she would not be there to see it. Florence wore a simple ivory dress, nothing like the elaborate gown she might have worn in Boston, but she felt beautiful in it. And when Austin looked at her as she walked down the aisle, his eyes full of love and wonder, she knew she had never looked better. The ceremony was short and sweet. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Austin kissed Florence with such tenderness that Florence heard several women in the congregation sigh. Then they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Austin Reeves, and Florence felt her heart might burst with happiness. They held a small reception in the church hall with food that the townspeople had contributed. People came up to congratulate them, and Florence saw genuine warmth in their faces. She had been accepted, not as Margaret's replacement, but as herself, as Florence Reeves. That night back at the ranch, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her nursery, Austin carried Florence over the threshold of the bedroom that was now truly theirs. He set her down gently, his hands trembling slightly. "I have been waiting for this," he said, his voice low. "Wanting you. But I need you to be sure, Florence. If you need more time," Florence silenced him with a kiss, pouring every ounce of love and desire she felt into it. "I am sure," she said against his lips. "I am your wife, Austin. I want this. I want you." What followed was tender and passionate, a claiming and a surrender on both sides. Austin was gentle with her, patient and reverent, and Florence discovered that the physical expression of love was even more powerful than she had imagined. They came together in the darkness with whispered words and shared breath, and when it was over, Florence lay in Austin's arms feeling complete in a way she had never experienced before. "I love you," Austin murmured into her hair. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for staying." "There is nowhere else I would rather be," Florence replied truthfully. The autumn passed in a golden haze of happiness. Florence threw herself into ranch life, learning everything she could. She helped Austin with the cattle, learned to can vegetables for winter, worked on improving the house. Hope grew and thrived, becoming more alert and responsive, her little personality beginning to emerge. She had Margaret's smile, but Florence saw Austin in her eyes, and sometimes herself too, as she was the one Hope saw most often. In October, they held a small ceremony in the meadow where Austin had first kissed Florence, planting apple saplings that would become Margaret's orchard. Florence spoke a few words about her sister, about love and memory and moving forward, and Austin laid flowers at the base of each tree. It was healing, Florence thought, this ritual acknowledgement of the past while investing in the future. As winter approached, Florence discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with a mix of emotions, joy certainly, but also fear. Margaret had died in childbirth. What if the same thing happened to her? Austin was overjoyed when she told him, but Florence could see the fear in his eyes too. That night he held her close and said, "I cannot lose you. I will not survive it." "You will not lose me," Florence said with more confidence than she felt. "I am strong, and we will have Mrs. Chen here and the doctor. I will be fine." "Promise me," Austin said fiercely. "I promise I will fight with everything I have to stay with you," Florence said. "That is all I can promise." The winter was hard, as mountain winters were. Snow piled deep, and for weeks at a time they were isolated at the ranch. But Florence found she did not mind. She loved the cozy evenings by the fire, loved watching Austin play with Hope, loved the quiet intimacy of their small family world. Her pregnancy progressed normally, though she was sick most mornings and grew large more quickly than she had expected. "It is the altitude," Mrs. Chen said during one of her visits. "Babies grow different up here." In March, when the snow was beginning to melt and wildflowers were starting to push through the earth, Florence went into labor. Austin was terrified, trying to hide it and failing, but Florence felt strangely calm. This was different from Margaret's situation. She could feel it. Her body was working the way it was supposed to, strong and sure. The labor was long, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Mrs. Chen remained confident throughout. And when the final push came and Florence heard the sharp, indignant cry of her newborn, she knew everything would be all right. "A boy," Mrs. Chen announced, placing the squirming, red bundle on Florence's chest. "A healthy, perfect boy." Florence looked down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He had dark hair like Austin, but her green eyes, and he was beautiful in the way all newborns were beautiful, full of possibility. Austin appeared in the doorway, white-faced with worry, and Florence smiled at him. "We have a son," she said. "Come meet him." Austin crossed the room in 3 strides, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. He stared at the baby with wonder, one finger gently touching the tiny hand, which immediately curled around it. "He is perfect," Austin breathed. "You are perfect." "God, Florence, I was so scared." "I know, but I am all right. We are all right." They named him Andrew after Austin's father, who had died when Austin was young. Andrew Reeves. He was a good baby, calm and observant, and Hope was fascinated by him, toddling over to his cradle constantly to peer at him with serious concentration. The years that followed were the happiest of Florence's life. The ranch prospered, growing larger as Austin's reputation as a horseman spread. They added onto the house, creating more rooms for their growing family. Florence gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Grace in 1886 and another son, William, in 1888. Each birth terrified Austin, but each time Florence came through strong and healthy, and each time their family grew more complete. Hope grew into a bright, adventurous child with her mother's spirit and her father's steadiness. She took piano lessons from the music teacher who had moved to Granite, and she loved to read, consuming every book Florence could get her hands on. Andrew was quieter but just as determined, helping his father with the horses from the time he could walk. Grace was pure joy, laughing at everything, and William was still too young to show much personality beyond an impressive set of lungs. Margaret's orchard flourished, the apple trees growing strong and producing abundant fruit. Every fall, Florence and the children would harvest the apples, making pies and preserves, and Florence would tell them stories about their Aunt Margaret, keeping her memory alive. Florence's parents visited occasionally, though her father never fully approved of her choices. But her mother softened over time, especially as she got to know her grandchildren. On one visit, when Hope was 7 and performing a piano piece she had learned, Florence's mother leaned over and whispered, "You chose well, daughter. Margaret would be proud." The words meant more to Florence than she could say. Austin became a fixture in the community, respected, and liked. He served on the town council for a term and helped organize the school that was built in 1890. But his heart was always with his family and his land. Florence would sometimes catch him watching her from across the room, a look of contentment on his face, and she would know exactly what he was thinking, that they had built something real together, something lasting. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Austin took Florence back to the meadow where he had first told her he loved her. The children were with Mrs. Chen in town, giving them a rare day alone together. The orchard had matured, the trees in full leaf, and the wildflowers were in bloom just as they had been that first time. "I have been thinking about that day," Austin said, his arm around Florence's waist as they stood looking out at the view. "When I told you, I noticed you. I was so afraid of what I was feeling, thought it was a betrayal of Margaret." "I felt the same way," Florence admitted. "But now I understand that love does not replace love. It expands. I loved Margaret and I always will, but I love you too, differently but just as deeply. You did not replace your sister. You became your own person in my life, irreplaceable in your own right." Florence turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. There was gray in his hair now, lines around his eyes from years of sun and smiling, but he was still the man who had taken her breath away that first day on the platform in Granite. "You gave me a life I never imagined I could have," Florence said. "You gave me purpose and love and a family. Every day I am grateful that train brought me here." "The train brought you to replace your sister," Austin said, echoing the words he had said years ago. "But I did not want your sister. I wanted you. I want you still. I will want you always." They kissed then, surrounded by Margaret's trees and the mountains that had witnessed their love story, and Florence knew with absolute certainty that this was her happy ending. Not the one she had planned, not the one she could have imagined back in Boston, but the one that was always meant to be hers. Life continued in its beautiful, messy way. The children grew. The ranch expanded. Austin and Florence grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. There were challenges, certainly. Droughts that tested their resources, a bad winter that killed some of the cattle, Hope's bout with scarlet fever that had them terrified for weeks. But they faced everything together, stronger as a unit than they ever could have been alone. Hope eventually married a lawyer who moved to Granite from Denver, and they gave Florence and Austin their first grandchild. Andrew took over more of the ranch operations, showing a natural talent for the work. Grace became a teacher in the Granite School. William, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming interested in medicine, eventually leaving for medical school back east, though he promised to return and practice in Colorado. On a summer evening in 1902, when Florence was 40 years old and Austin was 45, they sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. Hope's children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the evening air. Andrew was checking the fences in the near pasture. Grace was inside preparing dinner. William would be coming home for a visit next month. "We did well," Austin said, reaching over to take Florence's hand. It was something he said often, a simple acknowledgement of what they had built together. "We did," Florence agreed, squeezing his fingers. She thought about the woman she had been 20 years ago, stepping off that train with grief heavy in her heart and duty driving her forward. She had come to replace her sister, to help raise a child who needed her. She had not come looking for love, had not expected to find a home in the wilderness, had not imagined that her life would bloom into something so rich and full. But life had surprised her. Austin had surprised her. She had surprised herself. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them in that meadow. "I love you too," Austin replied, his voice warm with contentment. As the sun sank behind the mountains and the sky turned to gold and pink and purple, Florence Reeves sat beside her husband and knew that this was happiness. Not perfect, not without its sorrows and struggles, but real and earned and lasting. The train had carried her west to replace her sister, but she had found so much more than duty. She had found love, found purpose, found herself. And that, she thought as Austin's hand tightened around hers and their grandchildren's laughter rang out into the evening, was the greatest gift of all. She had come to give Hope a family, but in the process, she had gained one herself. A family built on love and choice and the courage to embrace a second chance. A family that would continue long after she and Austin were gone. Their legacy written not just in the land they had tended, but in the children and grandchildren who would carry their story forward. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their love, and as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Florence felt at peace. This was her life, her choice, her joy, and she would not trade a single moment of it.